everyone start, I just want to start with you just kind of giving me a real brief on,
Yeah,
what your role was in previous administrations.
sure. So I spent 2 years as Assistant White House Press Secretary and Director of Television News for President George W. Bush after 9/11 and before his 2004 reelection, where I worked with Ari Fleischer and then with Scott McClellan. And the entire press office's job is to help the press secretary do his or her job. And in that case, it was helping Ari and Scott get ready for briefings, help the president get ready for briefings, and execute on all those.
Real briefly, because you're a history guy, tell me a little about the history of the White House press briefing. What is, when's the first official one, and then when did it become a TV thing?
Sure. Well, presidents have always had relationships with the press, but it wasn't until the West Wing of the White House was built and it was the official office of the president that you really had the press living in there and working in there alongside of the administration officials. So presidents started briefing the press one-on-one in small groups, but it wasn't until Woodrow Wilson, who'd been a college professor, who was very familiar with standing in front of behind a lectern and answering questions from students, which is more or less how he treated the press corps, both in New Jersey as governor, and then when he came to the White House. And he did, I think he proclaimed in his first press briefing, on the record press briefing, that he loved the press. And it was the headline of the Washington Post. And that's really when before, it predates the Office of Press Secretary, which wasn't for a few administrations later. FDR was the first person to have a real press secretary. He gave on the record briefings all the time. You can go online and look at the FDR library. They have them. I think it's over 1,000 of them. His 12 years. And then when you had press secretaries, John Kennedy was the first one to have a live, unedited television briefing, which is really, and his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, used to brief the press both on camera and off camera, and famously briefed the press after President Kennedy was assassinated. There's video of that. But, that the press room that you see there was actually built by Richard Nixon. FDR had a pool in there, which he used to use for physical exercise, and everybody else kept it. Nixon didn't think it was necessary, so he paved over it made a room over it, and it became the press room. When I was there, they'd renovated, since all the cables for the networks and radio were all in the pool still under the floorboards. And it became a fire hazard at one point, so they renovated it. But Nixon was the person who did that. I think he probably lived to regret it, given some of the more famous quotes we have from Nixon being, "I am not a crook," and other things from that, and his press secretary famously calling Watergate a third-rate burglary. But all those things were on the record. And so, other presidents, famously during Ronald Reagan's tenure, first during the assassination attempt, when it was we actually had a press secretary who was injured in the line of duty, James Baker. Mm-hmm. But those famous scenes of Al Haig declaring he was in charge and from the White House podium, and sort of missing the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate. But that's neither here nor there. But so that room has become this place you look to during tragedies, during national emergencies. After 9/11, it became, a place that Americans went to get official information about what was going on, the latest in the investigation, latest in what the United States response was. All of those things, President Clinton used it after things like the Oklahoma City bombing and other things. There was and the downside of it was, and they actually began the televised daily press secretary briefings during the Clinton administration. Mike McCurry, his press secretary, did that. And most of that was to get their message out, because it started when he was running for re-election, 1996, 1995, 96. But it continued, and the good of it is you can get your message out. The bad of it is when there's a spotlight on your administration, a scandal, you get asked from the podium about it every day.
Even on those days when you were talking about 9/11 or the Clintons, the Lewinsky scandal, you didn't see the president speaking every day. Is this sort of unprecedented, or how does this look?
It's completely unprecedented. First of all, it's difficult. Quite frankly, you never really had a press secretary do it every single day, because what would happen is, like, for example, I loved the State of the Union Day because you didn't brief. Anytime the president was giving a major speech, you didn't brief. Anytime the president was traveling, you didn't brief.
As you're watching this unfold day to day, does it seem to have the urgency of what we normally would see a White House press briefing for? And it's fair, I think, to at least ask, does it feel like a little bit of the campaign come to life?
Well, look, make no mistake, everything every president does from that podium is either dedicated toward two things: campaigning or legacy. That's the way it works. What you're seeing now, and I rarely at a loss for words when it comes to these things, but Trump believes that when he is one-on-one with the American people, unfiltered, whether it's in his Twitter feed or on television, that he has a connection, that he can communicate with them directly, unfiltered by the press. Now, he obviously resents being questioned. I've never seen either a president or a press secretary respond to being questioned. Bush didn't like it. I promise you, President George W. Bush did not like it. President Clinton, I don't think liked being challenged. I'm pretty sure, I've never spoken to President Obama about it, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't a favorite part of the job for him. But they do it because it's part of the job. Trump, like everything, has his own style. And so what you've seen is Trump believing that the more he's in front of the American people directly, unfiltered, is better for him. He's running for re-election. He believes he can bend the narrative to the way he sees it. And he thinks that that's what he's accomplishing. I'm not sure if it is. I always looked at presidencies, and I've only been doing this since we've had a 2-term limit. You can only serve 2 terms. But by the 8th year of presidency, people are tired of that show.
Yeah.
They always have been. And by the way, I was first in college when at the end of Ronald Reagan's term, and people were tired of that. Obviously, Bush 41 only served 4 years, but people were happy to have a change there. Clinton, they were tired of it. And again, it just gets, and so, just from a pure communication standpoint, I don't particularly think it's a good idea. Then when you throw in Trump's penchant for saying remarkably stupid things, which he just does. I mean, that cliche definition of a gaffe in Washington used to be telling the truth. I'm not sure what he's doing, but look, it was funny because when I worked for President Bush, I wasn't there on 9/11, but I was there on the first anniversary. And we actually had all the networks and everybody wanted, basically all the administration officials, including the president, to give interviews on the first anniversary of 9/11. And it was interviews with everybody on where they were and what they remember. And I was thinking about the other day, about the empathy part. And I mistakenly, wasn't there. I've seen the video. I've talked to every single person who was in the room who briefed him, but I wasn't there, but I believed I was because, again, I watched it. When George W. Bush got off the phone with George Pataki in the first few days after 9/11, he cried. And I remembered it very vividly. And I remember it because I watched it in California where I was working at the time. But again, after having worked with him for a year after that, and then coordinated all those interviews and watched them in total, that was a seminal moment, just in the sense of, Bush wanted to portray the image of dead or alive. That's one of the things he said, which was one of his gaffes. And his wife let him have it and said, "So you're going to get him, Bushy?" So, she would make fun of him about that. But what came across was, David Axelrod has described the president's running for the presidency and the presidency itself as an MRI for the soul. And I think that that's probably true. You saw it in President Clinton after Oklahoma City. You saw it in President Bush after 9/11. You saw it with President Obama after, unfortunately, too many school shootings and too many church shootings. But you see this. And, I remember, obviously, I worked in the White House when the first soldiers started coming home from Iraq, the remains of the soldiers coming home and being met by their families. And President Bush, those things tortured him. And it's important to have that in a president. I think